He died a criminal's death. The earth grew restless and dark, and it was finished. But the story doesn't end there. The stone was rolled away. The tomb was empty. He had conquered the grave. No more sorrow, no more pain. New life awaits. The darkness runs and hides from the very light he brings. Can you see it?
Here's what I believe to be true. The stories that you just heard of life being turned upside down and hope being present where it seems like there should be none, that is only possible if the tomb is empty. It's only possible if Jesus is alive, because dead things, dead people don't change anything. Only living saviors can do what you just saw. And I say this often, but whenever we have a baptism, I feel like, why do I need to preach? Because you heard it all in living color, and I think that that is the best way to hear of the hope that we have in Jesus. But I'm excited to spend just a few minutes together this morning talking about the real life implications of an empty tomb. What does that mean? Because if you're anything like me, you've maybe grown up going to church, at least every Easter going to church, because mom told you got to go to church on Easter. You've heard this story, right? But maybe never thought through, what does it do today? What does that empty grave in the middle of Jerusalem have anything to do with my everyday life, when I go to work, when I'm with my family, when I'm eating dinner? And so I want to explore that together, and I'm excited to do that by starting with a really simple question. Have you ever heard of a gigawatt? You know what a gigawatt is? It's a lot of watts. That's what it is. And 1.21 gigawatts is 1,210,000,000 watts. It's the equivalent of a small nuclear reaction. It's also the equivalent of the amount of energy required to power the flux capacitor. And to destroy the clock tower in the middle of Hill Valley in 1955. I don't know how you feel about the Back to the Future movies, but they continue to be one of my favorites, not just because it messes with time and it's got crazy cool characters and all that, but because there are some ideas present in it that are kind of behind the scenes yet powerful. Things that I believe can help us change how we look at our world today. What's interesting about 1.21 gigawatts and the flux capacitor and all that is that they were able to get that kind of energy, to harness that kind of power through a lightning bolt. And what they learned was that lightning and the power that it delivers is indiscriminate in where it delivers it. You just have to be in the right position. You have to be in the right place at the right time. And that same power that can destroy a clock tower, that can deliver a lightning bolt, can change your life forever. That's what Marty McFly learned. He learned that if they got in the right place, the right time, and harnessed the energy, he could be delivered to a life that he'd always dreamt of. That in fact, to that point, he didn't know was possible. And the entire movie, this entire situation, is based on what's called a conditional statement. Now, you're familiar with these because you went to school and there was a unit in your schooling that talked about conditional statements. They're these kinds of statements. If, then. Do you remember these? If this thing is true, then that thing is true. If this thing happens, then that thing happens. It would go like this. If it rains today, then the picnic is canceled. This is what draws us into things like 4 Easy Payments of 1999. Because the person in the commercial says, if you have this thing, then everything will be better. This is why we're drawn to that promise on the cover of a magazine that says if you follow these 8 easy steps, you will have a magnificent beach body by June. And we fall for it every time. It's why, even though we fail over and over again, Pinterest keeps sucking us back in. Because it tells you if you use this ingredient at this temperature and you use these supplies, then you will have an awesome life. You see, what we get suckered into, what we chase after, what we fall for is never a product. It's never a product. It's the promise. It's the promise of a different life that comes with those things. And they bank all of that advertising on that sensation that you get when you hear, if you have this, then you will have that. It's that easy, right? And it's this idea, conditional statements, that for me makes Easter so compelling. So captivating. In the morning on Easter when I wake up and the fog wears out and I get a cup of coffee and I start to think about what this day means, it leaves me utterly speechless. And the empty tomb provides for me the most powerful conditional statement that has ever been stated. And it goes like this: if God raised Jesus from the dead, then he can do the same for you. If Jesus came out of the tomb, then new life is possible for me. If this, then that. It's an incredible reality that you and I get to live with every day, because the resurrection was not just a moment that we've gone past and we leave in the past. It has practical, actual, real life implications today for us. Now, this statement gets rolled out in a very kind of blatant way in the book of Romans. If you want to follow along in your own Bible today, that's where we're going to be. If you're not familiar with the idea of a book called Romans, it's actually a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to a group of Christians that lived in Rome. And here's what's so interesting about Romans before we even launch into the text. Romans was written in about 57 AD. Now, here's why that date is so important. It's only about 25 years after the events of Easter. It's only about 25 years after the crucifixion and after the resurrection and after the ascension when Jesus went up into heaven. Now, here's why that's important to know. That's not enough time for a legend to be created. Sociologists have found that it takes 100 years for a legend to take place. And do you know why it takes 100 years? Because you have to wait for everyone who was actually there and can testify to the validity of that legend. You have to wait until they die. So Paul begins to write this letter where he's talking about a risen Jesus and the implications for you and I. He starts writing that while people are still alive who knew Jesus. People who walked around, people who saw that his lungs were no longer breathing, that his heart was no longer beating. They were there when they put him in the tomb. And they were there on the beach that one day because Peter's still running around. Peter was the guy out in the boat. About a week after Jesus was raised from the dead, he's out in his boat and he's fishing thinking it's all over. I gave my life for nothing. And then this guy on the beach calls to him and says, Peter, come over here. Peter goes, I know that voice, but it can't be. And he looks and he realizes it's him. It's Jesus, and so Peter, being Peter, this is why I love him, jumps right out of the boat and swims to shore. And when he gets there, Jesus is making breakfast on the beach. So this guy who was there, who touched Jesus and hung out with him again after the resurrection, he's still rolling around. And if he read Romans and it wasn't true, he could have gone, he's a liar, don't listen to him. But instead, Peter goes, he is spot on. There just hadn't been enough time. Paul himself had been alive all through Jesus' life. He knew all about Jesus. In fact, it was Paul on a road to a town called Damascus that met the risen Jesus in the middle of the street. And so Paul's not writing a letter based on some grand fairy tale. He's writing a letter that he knew to be true. and that people he trusted knew to be true. And so what he talks about is, if it's true, then this is true too. Listen to what he says in Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 10. Christ lives within you. So even though your body will die because of sin, the Spirit gives you life because you have been made right with God. The Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. And just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, he will give life to your mortal bodies by this same Spirit living within you. I think what Paul is getting at is a conditional statement. I don't know if you caught it when we initially read through, and he doesn't word it exactly like this, but it goes something like this. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then he can do the same for you, because you have the same Spirit where? Within you. He makes that point emphatically. Those first few sentences, there's just 3 sentences, and in each of them, he makes a point of the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. That this was not just a moment of resurrection, it's something that carries on into your everyday. The same Spirit that was in that tomb, that put breath back in his lungs and got his heart beating again, is available to you. The same power. Not your power, make no mistake, but his in you. And here's what that means. If God can take Jesus back to life, he can take all the dead parts of your life and breathe life back into it. You think about what resurrection means. It's so much more loaded than you were dead and now you're alive. There's way more to it than that. It means things like this. Jesus was revived. He was restored. He was revitalized. He was regenerated. He was rejuvenated. He was relaunched. And what Paul says is, all that made that happen can make it happen for you, can bring life to your life. That you don't have to be stuck at this dead end that most of us feel victim to. And we think, I just have to survive. I just have to get through my next day, my next week, my next year. And we get caught in these patterns in our life that we think define us. And the truth is, when we look at it soberly, we realize there's no life in that at all. That in a lot of ways, to steal a phrase from a movie title, we're all dead men walking. And I'm not trying to get all super religious. I'm just saying, if this is the life we live, then we're not living at all. Paul, in another letter he wrote to a town in Galatia, put it this way. It's from the Message, so it's a paraphrase, but I love the way it's worded. He would say, we're caught in a life that's full of repetitive, loveless, cheap sex. A stinking accumulation of mental and emotional garbage. Frenzied and joyless grabs for happiness. Trinket gods, magic show religion, paranoid loneliness, cutthroat competition. All-consuming yet never satisfied wants. A brutal temper, an impotence to love or be loved, divided homes and divided lives, small-minded and lopsided pursuits. The vicious habit of depersonalizing anyone and everyone into a rival. Uncontrolled and uncontrollable addictions. Ugly parodies of community. That's why I call it the living Word of God. Because I think that describes our reality. Maybe not all of those things apply to you, but there was parts where you went, that's my everyday when the alarm goes off. And I feel powerless to do anything with it. I feel powerless to change it. I feel stuck. And I see that it's dead. I see that there's no life in it, but I don't know what to do. What I want to encourage you with is a conditional statement that Paul comes back to over and over again. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then he can do the same for you. He can take that list where there's no life and breathe life into it and bring you to life, to what Jesus called life to the fullest, life plus some, revived, rejuvenated, restored, and relaunched. This is how Paul put it in Galatians, same translation. He says, affection for others. This is what's available to you in the new life God breathes, the Spirit breathes into you. Affection for others, exuberance about life, serenity, a willingness to stick with things, a sense of compassion in the heart, a conviction that a basic holiness permeates things and people. We find ourselves involved in loyal commitments, not needing to force our way in life, able to marshal and direct our energies wisely. If you ask me, that is life. That's the life that I want to live. That's life fuller than the life that I've been living to this point. And you don't have to be a church person. You don't even have to be a Christian to compare those two things and go, yeah, one feels vibrant and alive, and one feels cold and dead. You don't have to be a Christian or go to church for very long to be able to go, I know which one I want. But again, we feel stuck. We feel like, how can we have life where there seems to be only death? The key is not in you becoming a better human. The key is in getting yourself in a position where you can receive the power of the Spirit that Paul has been talking about. And then you may become a better human. But don't start there. The ability to change and become alive where there was only death only comes through the Spirit of God. Now, I am a simpleton. I cannot think on very complex levels. Everything has to become a picture. And so I have been thinking about this concept when it comes to speakers and headphones and music. Here's what I've realized. This speaker right here is completely and utterly useless right now. It's just sitting here. And if we could decide, is it alive or is it dead, most of you would say it's dead. There's nothing coming out of it. So what purpose does it have? And a lot of us feel like this is the definition of our life. And in reality, this was Jesus on Good Friday. But then Paul says the Spirit of God began to breathe new life into Jesus. And he came back to life, like when I connect this dead speaker with a life source. Here's what's so interesting. What you're about to hear is not coming from this speaker. It's coming from this phone. No matter how hard I try, before I plug this phone into the speaker, it will remain dead. But when I introduce my little metaphor for the Spirit, suddenly it's alive. And everybody in this room is witness to it as life. Everybody in the lower auditorium watching online is going, it's alive now. I'm game for taking that speaker home with me. And here's what's amazing about the promise we have. God says, listen, if the Spirit can do this for Jesus, he can do it for you too. You don't need to be a techie to know that when I plug these headphones in to the same source, the same thing will result. I know that you can't hear it, but I can. There's music pumping out of these earphones. This person's very happy right now. The same principle applies, though. The headphones are not making the music. The headphones are coming from the phone. These are just a vessel to deliver them to someone. They just had to get in a position to receive it. It's the same source. And Paul says the same source that brought Jesus back and out of the tomb is available to you and can bring you out of the death that you seem to be stuck in every day of your life. You can have life to the fullest. And what's so amazing is that it doesn't matter which set of headphones I plug these things into. All of them are going to do the same thing, aren't they? They're going to come to life, and music will start playing. It doesn't matter what shape the headphones are. It doesn't matter what color the headphones are. It doesn't matter where those headphones came from. By the way, I stole them from several staff members' offices. But they all come to life from the same source that the big speaker did. And Paul says this is what's available to you. You can come to life just like Jesus came to life. That is the practical, actual, real-time implication. That's the if-then statement. If God can do that with Jesus, the big, powerful speaker, then he can certainly do it with you. And what Paul does next is he says, now that's good to know, but that's not where it stays. There's implications of the implication. This is what he says in verse 12. Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, you have no obligation to do what your sinful nature urges you to do. For if you live by its dictates, you will die. But if through the power of the Spirit you put to death the deeds of your sinful nature, you will live. Once these headphones have had life breathed into them, they no longer have any obligation to be silent. They can just continue to play music. I can put the playlist on repeat and they will just continue. There's no reason for them to shut back off. And Paul says, listen, in your life, when God breathes life into you, you're not obliged any longer to behave as if you were dead. In fact, what he says is you can put dead things where they belong, in the grave. He says, put to death the deeds. Put to death the thinking. Put to death the ways of living. Which is why Jesus walked out of the tomb, by the way. Dead things belong in a tomb. He was not dead. And so Paul says, listen, you take your sadness, you take your anger, you take your fear, you take your anxiety, you take your self-loathing, you take all of the things that are going on in your heart and in your head as a result of that first list, and you bury them 6 feet under. And then you walk in Jesus' footsteps into life like you didn't know was possible as a human being. Here's what I believe the resurrection teaches us. Jesus came back so you can come back too. Jesus came back so that you would know, so that you would experience, so that you would own a comeback for yourself, that you don't have to stay in the life that you feel stuck in. And it's so intense. The reality for you and I is so intense that Paul employs a metaphor that is so powerful, not just in my life, but especially in a Roman's life. This is what he says in the next sentence. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. So you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. Instead, you received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. Now we call him Abba, Father, for his Spirit joins with our spirit to affirm that we are God's children. The metaphor Paul uses is adoption. And one of the greatest gifts that God has given me in my life is a circle of friends who have adopted a lot of children. And to watch these friends treat these children who are not their blood as if they were. And in Roman times, it was even more intense. They understood that when you're adopted, you give up all the old history. You give up all the old identity. That no longer defines you. You take on the name of your new daddy. You take on the name of your new mom. You become not just an adopted child, you become a child. You are a full heir. And what's so incredible in the Roman times, the parents would handpick, I want that child to inherit my kingdom. And what the resurrection says is the same Spirit that's in you becomes your adoption papers, and it's so intense and it's so real and it's so certain that you need to change your name. You have been adopted. It says clearly, he adopted you. So leave that dead stuff behind and live the life that he calls you to. Jesus came back so you could come back too. Let's go back to 1.21 gigawatts, because this is important. You remember what they had to learn. They had to learn how to be in position to receive that power and harness it in a way that would deliver them to this life that they've been wanting. And you and I would look at that list again and we go, I think I want that second list, the one about serenity and exuberance for life. Well, how do I get in a position to receive that? How do I get that kind of power flowing through me that I recognize is not mine, but His? But how do I begin to receive it? I want to give you two quick ideas. And I think no matter who you are, where you came from, all of us fit into one of these two categories. Some of us need to bury the dead. Some of us are walking around all day, every day, as if zombies were a normal thing. And we let the dead stuff in our life follow us all over the place. And we carry it around with us all day, every day. The stuff we supposedly left behind, the stuff that we believe was nailed to a cross with Jesus, and Christian or not, we're letting the dead stuff walk. And instead, what we need to do is put it where dead things belong, in that tomb. That's where dead things go. So for some of you, it's a starting step. It's the first step out of the grave where you go, I'm going to follow Jesus. He seems to know the way to life. And so I'm going to follow Him. And you might take that first step today. For others of you, you're like a full-time Christian. You're all in on this thing, but you've just never come to the place where you recognize that I don't have to live this way anymore. That there are practical ramifications and implications for the truth of what I believe, that I can live the full life that Jesus calls me to live. So I don't know what that is for you. I don't know what your list is, but I could not encourage you more strongly to leave them in the grave. Jesus didn't die for you to carry that stuff around. Others of us, we need to start for the very first time to live alive. This is an idea that I've just recently kind of come in contact with, but I've recognized that I have the greatest hope in the world. I know Jesus of Nazareth, the one they brutally beat and murdered and then said, I'm not done yet, coming back, and is alive today. I know Him, and if I believe that that's true, if I believe it down in my heart, in my soul, why do I act like it's just a fairy tale? I'm not living. And so I've been wrestling with these questions, and I'm going to challenge you to wrestle with them too. This is especially good thinking for Christians. Do they see it? When you're around other people, do they go, that person knows something that I don't know, and I'm curious what it is? So, do they see the joy in you? Have you ever watched a comeback in sports? I know we're not all sports fans, but odds are at some point you found yourself on a couch watching the end of a game. And there was maybe this one time where a team had been behind the entire game, and then in the last part of the game, they start to make this comeback, and then they win. Do you know what happens when they win? Everybody loses their mind. People are jumping up and down, they're laughing and they're crying, they're throwing food, they're storming the court. The person that was sitting on the couch next to you is not sitting there anymore. You're going to have to pull them off the ceiling because this is so incredible what just happened. They made a comeback, and comebacks are always joyous occasions. You and I know about the greatest comeback that's ever happened. Why don't they see that in us? We should be storming the court every day because we have that joy. Do they see the hope in you? I grew up a Bulls fan because, Michael Jordan. But my favorite interview from a Bulls player was not Michael Jordan, it was Will Perdue. I know, you probably don't know who he is. Most people don't. He was the one other guy on the team. And in the interview, he says, I went into every game, every quarter, no matter how far behind we were, with hope that we would pull it out. You know why? Because we got Michael Jordan. Why don't I approach every day, I never thought I'd say this, like Will Perdue? I got Jesus, the only one on His own power who ever beat death. I got Him. And he says he fights for me. He says he loves me. He says he's with me. Why did they not see the hope in me? Why do people in my life not see the vibrancy, the energy that comes with that? You watch the teams that have hope. You watch the teams that are on the verge of a comeback and how they play the game. There's energy. Do they see it? For those of us who would say no, no, no. For those of us who would say, my team is made up of dead things, it might be time to rearrange your comfort zone. And what you may not want to hear, but I think is true, because it's true for me, my comfort zone is decorated like a tomb. And what I've learned is that the more comfortable I get there, the longer I'm going to stay there. And dead things just become everyday things. And dead-end life just becomes the way of life. It might be time to take an assessment of how you've arranged your life and shake it up so that you don't even want to be there anymore, so that you start to walk out of that tomb. Some of us need to become a little bit more desperate. I know I need to become a little more desperate, where I'm just experiencing and leaning in more and more to the life that Jesus called me to, more and more into the comeback in my life. Because for something to be dead and come to life, that's not the same. It can't be comfortable anymore. For something to have been in a tomb for 3 days and then walk out of the tomb, you can't be comfortable in the tomb. You and I may need to rearrange the furniture so that we can live alive, so that we can leave the dead things behind us instead of carrying them around with us. Jesus made a comeback, so you can too. And the great thing is, he knows the perfect strategy to pull it off. He's done it on his own. He left his scriptures and he left his disciples' witness and all of those for us to understand what the footsteps, what the footprints look like out of that tomb so that we could follow it. But make no mistake, if a team coming into the end of the game continued to do things how they'd done them all the way along, they would lose. Every team that makes a comeback has to rearrange their strategy so that it's a different outcome than what they'd had to this point. You may need to rethink your strategy. And if I could ask you to do one thing, it would be to consider the strategy of Jesus. Consider the Spirit of God that raised him from the dead. And if you get in a position to receive it, he'll bring you to life too. That is the conditional statement. The conditional statement is not, if you get your life put together, then you'll be happy. The conditional statement is, if you follow Jesus, he will bring you to life. Let's pray. Lord, some of this feels very heavy. Some of it might even feel too out there to think about life where there was death, to think about your Spirit breathing into our lives and reviving us and restoring us and rejuvenating us. So I ask that you would just give us assurance of that reality, that you would give us confidence in that promise today. Lord, we can't thank you enough for giving us resurrection power. And so, Lord, what we want to do for the next few minutes is revisit the song that we started our time with you at and sing those words for ourselves. To think again about what it means to be adopted and to be clothed in your family crest. To think again about what it means to be free of the things that have held us back for so long, the dead weight in our life. So, Father, we will sing this song not because we're being asked to sing it, but because we believe it and we claim it for our lives. We believe that the same resurrection power that made Easter Sunday reality. You give it to us so that we don't have to live dead. And for that, we are